Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. With the tax surveys against BBC offices in Delhi and Mumbai continuing for 3 days, and they are now likely, it's said by sources, to continue a few more, we ask, how are they viewed in Britain? Joining me now to answer that particular question is the former editor of Britain's Financial Times, Lionel Barber. Mr. Barber has spent 15 years as the editor of the Financial Times. Mr. Barber, let me start with a simple general question. How do you, as a former editor of the Financial Times, view the surveys against BBC offices in Delhi and Bombay? To be honest, although the Indian government calls these surveys, the rest of the world is viewing them as tax raids. They're into their third day already, and sources are letting it be known that they could continue for a few more. So how do you view this?
Well, I'm not a tax inspector. I'm a journalist and a writer. And when I was editor at the Financial Times, all I can say is that we were very careful to respect the laws in local jurisdictions, whether they were India or China, all over the world. So I presume that the BBC would have also been fairly careful about how it's handling its operations. Now I don't know what's in the books. I don't know what the reasons are. What I do know is the optics of such raids are pretty bad because it looks like a vendetta. It looks like that because it's come so soon after the airing of the documentary on Mr. Modi and the Gujarati riots. So that's the problem. It's an optical question. We don't know what the BBC has done, and we don't know what the tax inspectors have found.
Let me pick up on that thought. The raids happened on Tuesday, exactly and precisely 3 weeks to the date after the second part of that two-part BBC documentary on Modi and Gujarat was screened. That documentary was not shown in India, but the government reacted furiously. It called it propaganda. It said it was a product of a colonial mindset, and it blocked it on YouTube and Twitter. You believe that this makes the timing of the raid suspicious?
No, I don't, because I have no idea whether it's 3 weeks, 2 weeks. I'm a great believer in the cock-up rather than the conspiracy theory of history. What I do know is what you've said, which is that the Indian government reacted very strongly to this documentary. They fundamentally, although there were spokesmen and supporters of the BJP quoted at length in this documentary, they were still extremely unhappy about it. And from the sources limited that I've had contact with, there's great concern. And here's the question of timing. Why did the BBC publish or air this documentary now? Nobody seems to be able to understand this. And again, I said, well, there's no particular reason why now. It's just Mr. Modi is one of the most powerful politicians in the world. India is an incredibly important strategically placed country. And what went on and the quality of leadership is still relevant to understanding Mr. Modi as a politician. That's that, I think. They wanted a second look.
In your first answer, you said it looks a bit like Vendetta. Could this be, in your eyes, an attempt to intimidate or an attempt to even seek revenge?
Well, no, I'm not into using words like revenge. Certainly intimidation, yes. I mean, if you look at, you publish a documentary, you're the BBC, and then 3 weeks later, you've got the tax police or inspectors on your doorstep. That's pretty intimidating. It is reminiscent of what, went on in the Soviet Union, Russia, etc. Now, again, that's the problem, and it does look like intimidation, yes, but
Now,
revenge is too strong.
let me ask you a question with your experience as a British editor of the Financial Times for 15 years. If the government were to have genuine concerns or questions about BBC taxes, is this an appropriate and sensible way of treating a media institution that's considered one of the most highly regarded in the world? Are there not better ways of doing it rather than visibly humiliating the BBC with a survey or raid?
Well, you're using the word humiliation and this, which is emotive. Look, if there's a tax problem, you can expect to get audited, people come round. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is the juxtaposition of the government reacting very strongly indeed. They want to ban it, the documentary, and then taking action in this respect. That's the problem. And so as a chief editor, I would say, well, let's look at the documentary. Was it fair? And deal with separately from a financial issue and an editorial issue.
I know you haven't seen the second part of that documentary, but I believe you've seen the first, and it was the first that really annoyed the government because it was seeking to establish connections between Mr. Modi as chief minister and what happened, and the government of Gujarat's inability to stop the rioting and prevent the deaths. Did you think that first part which you saw was fair? How would you evaluate it?
Well, as an editor, I would say the most important thing is that the other side, in this case, Mr. Modi and his support, not Mr. Modi, there was old film aired with Mr. Modi, but his supporters were given a chance to offer their interpretation of events. And I thought that in that sense, it sort of met the test of whether this was, totally one-sided or gave the other side a chance to speak. I didn't see the second documentary, so I am lacking in that respect.
One more question about that first documentary. Many in India have said, why is the BBC raising something and raking up something that happened 21 years ago, particularly when the Indian Supreme Court has exonerated Mr. Modi? Was it right to the BBC to do this documentary? Because after all, the BBC does documentaries on the Holocaust 70 years after it was over. Was it right to do something similar about Gujarat?
Yeah, I think this is really the nub of the question, Karen, because again, the limited conversations that I've had with Indians on all sides of the political spectrum, by the way, they don't really understand why this documentary was aired now. It looks like a deliberate attempt by the BBC to undermine the authority of Mr. Modi, who is now in his second term, and he's won 2 fair elections very clearly. It's important to say that. So why did the BBC air this documentary now? And my answer to that as an experienced journalist and editor is, look, nothing's off limits. Just because Mr. Modi is extremely popular and won 2 fair elections, and India is one of the most important countries in the world, that doesn't mean to say that a news organization like the BBC shouldn't go back and examine what was at the time an extremely controversial set of circumstances. Now, how much you can say Mr. Modi was directly responsible, how much may have been he been inexperienced, not knowing the levers of government, didn't have full control over the police. That's a very different thing from benign neglect or encouragement in retaliation from the earlier terrorist incident. So all I would say is nothing is off limits for a major news organization like the BBC. But I can assure you, If I'd been sitting in the Director General's seat, I would have said, there's going to be a pretty strong reaction from this. So I'm going to look at this documentary very, very carefully and make sure it meets a fair test of good journalism.
And one would presume that is precisely what happened at the BBC, but we simply can't say.
Well, I wasn't involved in this. I wasn't the editor. If the FT had been doing it, I can assure you it would have gone through several drafts.
Let me at this point put to you two comments made very recently about the BBC. First of all, the official spokesman of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party of the country, has called the BBC the most corrupt corporation in the world. Now, as someone who sees the BBC at first hand in London, how do you respond to that description of the BBC?
Well, it's slightly exaggerated. I mean, that, or even hyperbole. I mean, this is not the case. I can think of, I mean, how long have you got for me to list other news organizations that are more corrupt than the BBC? Look, that's just not the case. I mean, you know, they made mistakes. That's just not, that's ridiculous.
A senior lawyer who is now also a member of the upper house and used to be a member of the national executive of the BJP, has gone on record in India to claim that the BBC has clandestine links with the Chinese company Huawei. He's also alleged that there's a Chinese hand behind the making of the Modi Gujarat documentary. How do you respond to those claims of a Chinese connection?
Well, I haven't seen those claims. I haven't spoken to the individual, so I have no idea about this. All I can say is that, and I said this earlier, I don't believe in the conspiracy theory of history. And I certainly would say with some conviction that there is no Chinese hand behind this documentary. There's just some journalists who decided, why don't we take a look at one of the most important politicians in the world, in one of the most important countries in the world, and one of the most controversial stories in recent Indian history, and we'll take a second look. That's how it came about. There's no huge agenda here, and certainly not a Chinese agenda.
Are you aware of any troubling links and connections between the BBC and China, whether it's the Chinese government-owned companies, or Chinese enterprises in the private sector? Are you aware of any troubling connections or suggestions?
None. I mean, I don't work for the BBC, but I have no evidence that I know of.
Now,
and I would find it extremely surprising.
As you know, India is very proud of boasting that we are the world's largest democracy. Of late, our Prime Minister has begun to say that India is the mother of democracies. After this treatment of the BBC, how is that view claimed abroad?
Well, it's important to say that a functioning democracy depends on a free press and a free media. That doesn't mean that all media should have complete license. But obviously, this kind of this treatment of the BBC, it's very public. It's not exactly encouraging to those to support those claims. But I don't really want to go into any more than that, other than saying, it's the more important thing is why ban the documentary? I mean, in a confident democracy, you'd say, look, might disagree with it. You remember the old Voltaire comment? I may disagree with you fundamentally, but I'll defend until my last breath your right to say it. We all remember that in all democracies, in India and in Britain.
So has India's image as a democracy been damaged?
Let's see how this plays out. I mean, I think you've got to look at the broad sweep here. If I was in the BBC, I'd be wanting to have a word privately with the government and say, what's the problem here?
You're suggesting that this can be sorted out quietly behind closed doors rather than publicly.
Well, I'm not involved, so I'm not. I have no comment on this really because I'm not involved. If I was in the FT, if I and the FT faced a similar problem, then I'd probably say I wouldn't be going on your show. I'd be actually trying to sort this out with the Modi government.
Now, there are many in India, Mr. Barber, who are surprised that there's been no response at all from either the British government in London or the British High Commission in Delhi. Is this silence understandable, or do you think that given that the BBC is Britain's national broadcaster and paid for by taxpayers' money through the license fee, that it's a mistake to be silent when it looks to many in India that the BBC is being targeted and picked upon?
Well, again, the issue that the government's got to ask itself is what is the best way of dealing with this? Maybe a private channel, private conversation. What is the problem here? By the way, we might very politely suggest that this kind of treatment isn't necessarily good for India's image, but you'd say this privately, then maybe we can sort it out. I think the other point, which is important. I mean, Britain is very keen, this government, and I'm sure the future government will be very keen to establish and to reinforce good relations with India. The commercial and economic relationship is very important. We're out of the European Union now. So they don't want to do anything in public that's going to damage prospects of a free trade deal. There's some very important business at stake with India. And so I think that's probably in the background why they're not turning this into a public spat.
It sounds to me as if you're suggesting that India's importance in geopolitical terms as a bulwark against China, or in economic terms as a market of 1.4 billion, is a greater priority than protesting or criticizing India's treatment of the media, India's increasing intolerance of dissent. Is that suggestion something that I've wrongly picked up or correctly picked up?
Oh, forgive me, but I think you're putting words into my mouth, Karen. But that's not the first time it will have happened. Happens to me all the time. I don't think that you're necessarily making the right connection here. It's quite possible that the government has made private representations that you and I don't know about.
And you think private representations would be sufficient? There's no need to speak publicly because, after all, it is Britain's national channel that is being treated.
Again, let's see how this plays out. I mean, I'm not in the government, so let them do what they want to do. They don't need advice from me. I'm just a writer, journalist, and I would say, that it is clear to me that there is raison d'etat. There are economic interests, national security interests, where, is it a good idea to be publicly attacking the government in India? Probably not. But when maybe things can be said privately. I don't know.
My last question, is this having any impact on public opinion in Britain? Are people aware that the BBC is being treated in this way, and do they worry and care? Or is it something people are not really fully informed about?
No, it's been in the press and in the media, but it's not a huge story here. I'm afraid we've got a few economic problems of our own at the moment. And we're all very excited by the story that Nicola Sturgeon, the pro-independence leader in Scotland, has just resigned yesterday. So there are a few other things, and we're still mired in our Brexit problems. So that may account for the fact that the BBC story isn't on the front page. But maybe if it carries on, then maybe it will be get a bit more pickup.
Mr. Barber, thank you very much for making time for me.
It's a pleasure, Karen. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.